150 years ago, in the rugged Missouri Ozarks, weary travelers found shelter at a lonely cabin along the road. Two brothers offered water, warm stew, and a bed for the night, but what seemed like kindness concealed horrors no one could have imagined. When a postal carrier stumbled upon the cabin one snowy afternoon, he unknowingly uncovered a mystery that would shock generations. Vanished travelers, hidden chambers, and secrets buried in blood and bone. Before we dive into this chilling tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and if you enjoy unraveling forgotten mysteries. Don't forget to subscribe and join us as we uncover more stories that history tried to bury.
Welcome, friends, to a journey into one of Missouri's most chilling mysteries. A tale that has echoed through the hills of the Ozarks for generations. Before we step into this haunting chapter of history, imagine yourself pausing for a moment. Share where you're listening from and when. Because stories like this travel farther than we ever expect, crossing both distance and time. The year was 1867. The Civil War had ended just 2 years earlier. Yet the scars it left on the nation were fresh and deep. Missouri, torn between Union and Confederate loyalties, struggled to heal. In the rugged hills of the Ozarks, people worked hard to rebuild their lives, carving homes from wilderness, coaxing crops from stubborn earth, and traveling along primitive dirt paths that connected scattered settlements. For weary travelers, safe shelter was not just a convenience. It was salvation after a day on the trail. 17 miles northeast of Springfield in Webster County stood a modest cabin hidden among oak trees. Locals called it the Stillwell place. It wasn't marked on maps, but those who passed by remembered its small hand-painted sign: water and rest for weary travelers. The brothers who lived there, Elias, 37, and Jeremiah, 34, had settled during the war and kept mostly to themselves. Neighbors in Marshfield described them as quiet men, polite, dependable, never stirring trouble. They sold goods occasionally, fetched supplies in town, and returned to their cabin where strangers were offered water from their well, sometimes a meal, sometimes a bed. In those turbulent years, few people dared question where newcomers came from or what past they might be hiding. On December 12th of that year, a snowstorm swept across Webster County. Thomas Weston, a 31-year-old postal carrier and former scout who knew the hardships of the trail better than most, was caught in its grip. Seeking shelter, as he had done before, he guided his horse toward the Stillwell cabin. What he discovered there would not only disturb him personally, but would ignite one of the most unsettling investigations in Ozark history, an investigation that would remain unsolved for nearly a century. County records, testimonies, old newspapers like the Springfield Patriot, and even documents rediscovered during a courthouse renovation in 1952 would later piece together the account. Together, they painted a picture darker than anyone had imagined. The Stillwell Brothers' hospitality may have concealed horrors far more sinister than kindness and warm meals. That December afternoon, Weston rode through heavy snow with visibility so poor he nearly missed the turnoff. His horse stopped suddenly, as though sensing something was amiss. The cabin appeared different, lifeless. No smoke curled from the chimney, no lantern glowed in the window, no fresh tracks marked the snow. Unease settled over him. When he called out, no one answered. The door was unlocked, swinging open to reveal a cold, silent interior. A meal sat half-eaten on the table, food frozen solid as if time itself had stopped. Ashes lay dead in the fireplace. Their coats still hung near the door. Their rifles remained above the hearth. But Elias and Jeremiah were nowhere to be found. Weston later wrote that the silence was so heavy it rang in his ears. Troubled, he pushed on to Marshfield through the storm and reported what he'd found to Sheriff James Harrington. At first, explanations seemed simple. Perhaps the brothers had gone hunting. Perhaps they were visiting family. Perhaps the storm had forced them into shelter elsewhere. Yet the detail that unsettled Harrington was the abandoned meal. An interruption so sudden it hinted at something more. By the next day, he had assembled a search party, unaware they were about to uncover a mystery that would haunt Webster County for generations. What the sheriff's men found, or more disturbingly, what they did not find, marked the true beginning of a mystery that would deepen with each passing year. The Stillwell brothers had first appeared in Webster County during the summer of 1863, when Missouri was still bleeding from the Civil War. The Ozarks had become a haven for guerrilla fighters, deserters, and drifters. And in that chaos, two strangers building a cabin raised little suspicion. Land records later uncovered in 1952 revealed that Elias and Jeremiah purchased their property from Margaret Holloway, a war widow whose husband had been killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. A brutal clash fought just outside Springfield in 1861. The brothers paid in gold coins, a detail unusual enough to be noted in the deed, hinting at resources not common for men of their kind. They claimed to be from Kentucky, though they shared little else about their origins. Decades later, a journal belonging to Martha Simmons, the shopkeeper in Marshfield, provided a glimpse into their peculiar presence. "The Stillwell men keep to themselves, but are always proper in their dealings," she wrote. "The younger, one, Jeremiah, has a nervous manner, always watching the door. The elder speaks for them both." She noted their strange shopping habits: large amounts of coffee, salt, and preserving agents, yet little evidence of livestock or farming to explain the need. Elias explained that they smoked their own meat for the winter, though no one in town recalled them buying animals in any significant number. Travelers remembered the Stillwells for their deep well, which provided cold, clear water even in droughts, and later for the lean-to shelter they built. By 1865, they began offering hearty stew for a small fee, claiming the meat came from their own hunts. A cattle driver named Jacob Miller testified years later that the food was good. Elias was talkative, and Jeremiah handled chores. Yet Miller admitted something unsettling in hindsight. Though the brothers often spoke of visitors, he couldn't remember ever seeing anyone else there when he stopped. On the surface, the Stillwell cabin represented frontier hospitality, a welcome refuge on a treacherous road. But once the brothers vanished, the facade crumbled. On December 13th, Sheriff James Harrington and 6 men, including Thomas Weston, returned to the cabin under clear skies and a heavy blanket of snow. Their report, later discovered in courthouse renovations, told of an orderly home, no signs of struggle, possessions left untouched, rifles still mounted, coats still hanging. Yet beneath Elias's bed they found a hidden ledger. 37 entries spanning from 1863 to 1867, each listing a name, a date, and notations of value, sometimes marked with nothing more than an X. Several pages were torn out, leaving questions that could never be answered. The search extended beyond the cabin to the barn, smokehouse, and a root cellar carved into the hillside. The barn held only 1 mule, though tracks suggested at least 2 horses were missing. The smokehouse contained cuts of meat, assumed to be venison or pork, but the real horror awaited in the cellar. Sheriff Harrington described it with chilling precision. The root cellar stretched 15 feet into the hillside, its shelves lined with jars of preserves like any farmstead. But at the far end, the wall had been freshly dug, revealing a narrow tunnel that wound 27 feet deeper into the earth, terminating in a chamber roughly 8 by 10 feet. Whatever its purpose, it was no ordinary addition to a frontier homestead. It was the first undeniable clue that the Stillwell brothers had lived behind a mask of normalcy, concealing secrets far darker than anyone in Webster County had imagined. Inside the earthen chamber, the search party uncovered a scene that sent a shiver through even the most hardened men. Scattered across shelves and the packed dirt floor lay personal effects: watches, rings, worn coats, letters, and other belongings that clearly came from many different people. Most chilling of all were the 32 pairs of boots and shoes, some scuffed and broken from long miles on the trail, others nearly new, as though their owners had only just set them down. None of these items matched anything known to belong to Elias or Jeremiah Stillwell. The implication was as stark as it was horrifying. These were the possessions of strangers who had passed through the Stillwell cabin, never to be seen again. Yet there were no bodies, no blood, and no direct evidence of violence. The case, at this stage, relied entirely on the shadows cast by circumstance. Why would 2 reclusive brothers build a secret chamber and fill it with the belongings of others? Harrington's men scoured the woods and even dropped lines into the Stillwells. Deep well, but heavy snow crippled their search. The sheriff sealed off the property, posting guards, while he rode back to Marshfield to gather reinforcements. In a matter of days, word of the discovery ignited fear across Webster County. On December 17th, the Springfield Weekly Patriot splashed the story across its front page with the ominous headline, "Strange Disappearance in Webster County. Foul Play Suspected." As winter closed in, people began to revisit old memories of the Stillwells. Moments that once seemed trivial now appeared sinister. The cabin remained locked, its windows dark, a place shunned by locals who whispered of restless spirits. Sheriff Harrington pressed on, interviewing merchants, cattle drivers, and anyone who had crossed paths with the brothers. The ledger book became his most promising lead. Its 37 entries, each listing a name, date, and items of value. Watches, gold coins, fine coats, followed a disturbing pattern. Some entries bore an X beside them, often accompanied by notes about the quality of goods. The final entry, dated November 29, 1867, struck Harrington with particular force. J. Hammond, Springfield Merchant, Gold. Timepiece, 37 notes. Quality goods, X. Cross-referencing names, the sheriff discovered chilling connections. Joseph Hammond, a respected Springfield businessman, had been reported missing after failing to return from a trip to St. Louis that very month. Another entry listed William Cooper, a traveler who had vanished in July while heading to visit family. The ledger, once cryptic, now whispered of vanished men whose families were still waiting for them. By early 1868, Harrington compiled a grim tally. 23 missing travelers, all gone along the routes near the Stillwell property since the brothers' arrival in 1863. Among them was a name that struck at the heart of Ozark communities: Reverend Michael Donovan, a circuit preacher who vanished in April 1866. His entry in the ledger read, "Man of cloth, silver cross, few coins, books of no value, X." His congregation in Lebanon had searched desperately when he failed to arrive, but the trail had long since gone cold. Then, on February 23rd, as snow gave way to a brief thaw, deputies uncovered a shallow grave half a mile from the Stillwell cabin, hidden in a tangle of brambles. The remains wore the faded remnants of clerical garb, though the silver cross noted in the ledger was missing. The find confirmed the worst suspicions. The Stillwell brothers were tied directly to a disappearance. Yet this discovery raised new and disturbing questions. Why was Reverend Donovan buried so near the property while others seemed to vanish without a trace? Where were the rest of the missing travelers? And most haunting of all, what had truly taken place in that hidden chamber beneath the Stillwell cabin? According to Dr. William Hayes, the county physician who examined the remains, the discovery of Reverend Donovan's body revealed something far more sinister than simple murder. His examination notes described bones stripped of flesh with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge. Several long bones had been deliberately broken at the ends, consistent with marrow extraction. This was not mere robbery. It hinted at practices so grotesque that even seasoned frontier lawmen struggled to put words to their suspicions. When the ground thawed in March of 1868, Sheriff Harrington ordered a full excavation of the Stillwell property. 20 men joined the search, methodically probing the earth around the cabin, barn, and cellar. What they unearthed was recorded in cold bureaucratic language in county files, but local newspapers painted a much grimmer picture. The Springfield Weekly Patriot headline of March 19th read starkly, "Grim Discovery at Stillwell Farm, Human Remains Unearthed." Investigators recovered skeletal fragments in 3 locations: a deep pit behind the barn, a thicket 200 yards northwest of the cabin, and most horrifying of all, concealed within the very walls of the smokehouse. Dr. Hayes concluded that the remains belonged to at least 7 individuals. His notes described cuts and tool marks resembling those found in animal butchery. The most damning evidence came when he examined the preserved meats hanging in the smokehouse. What the search party first believed to be venison or pork proved, under Hayes's scrutiny, to be unmistakably human. His chilling words, preserved in the archives, read, "Certain preserved meats appear to be of human derivation, prepared in a manner suggesting anatomical knowledge and preservation techniques." The implications were unthinkable. Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell were not merely robbing and murdering travelers. They were processing their victims' remains as food, even serving that food to other unsuspecting passers-by. Yet despite the mounting evidence of their crimes, the brothers themselves were gone. Their coats, rifles, and the half-eaten meal on their table seemed frozen in time, mocking investigators with unanswered questions. Had they fled? Had someone turned the same horrors upon them? In April, a new twist emerged. Theodore Palmer, a trapper known throughout the Ozarks, came forward with an affidavit. On December 11th, the day before the disappearance was discovered, he claimed he had seen Jeremiah Stillwell near Beaver Creek, 5 miles north of the cabin. Jeremiah was on horseback, leading another horse carrying a bundle. Palmer recalled that the usually talkative younger brother barely acknowledged him, offering only a hurried nod before riding north. At the time, Palmer thought little of it. Only after hearing of the brothers' vanishing did he realize what he might have witnessed. If Palmer's account was true, Jeremiah left deliberately with supplies, which contradicted the abandoned scene inside the cabin. Had Elias been left behind? Had the brothers quarreled, one fleeing while the other became a victim? Or was it all part of a larger plan? Harrington extended his search northward, sending telegrams to lawmen across Missouri and neighboring states, but no confirmed sightings of either brother were ever reported. By summer, investigators dug into the Stillwells' supposed Kentucky origins, only to discover that no records of Elias or Jeremiah existed there. It was as though they had never lived before Webster County. This silence in the archives suggested Stillwell might have been a false name, chosen to bury a darker past. Sheriff Harrington sent inquiries far and wide, hunting for similar crimes that could connect the brothers to atrocities elsewhere. Then, another discovery surfaced, one that would push suspicion into certainty and forever brand the Stillwell name with dread. In the hidden chamber beneath the cabin, where investigators had already uncovered boots, rings, and other belongings, they found something even more unsettling: a small, leather-bound journal wedged behind a loose stone. It appeared to belong to Jeremiah Stillwell, with entries dating from 1864 to 1866. Most were ordinary notes about weather or daily chores, but tucked among them were passages that hinted at something far darker. One entry from August of 1864 read chillingly, "He says the stew needs more salt. Travelers don't notice any difference. Sometimes I wonder if they suspect. The well keeps our secret." Another entry dated April 1865 was even more disturbing. "3 men today, Army deserters. E said too risky, but they had good boots and a fine rifle. No one will look for them. Use the special herbs in their coffee." These cryptic notes suggested not only that the brothers had been killing travelers for years, but that they had perfected methods, possibly poisoning, to incapacitate their victims. The repeated reference to the well drew Sheriff Harrington's immediate attention. He ordered it drained, a task that proved both dangerous and grueling. The well plunged more than 60 feet into limestone, and at the bottom workers found 3 feet of silt and debris. What they retrieved turned the sheriff's suspicions into a grim certainty: finger and toe bones, loose teeth, buttons, a gold wedding band inscribed MH to JH 1858, and a leather pouch containing bundles of human hair tied neatly with thread. Dr. Hayes examined these remains and concluded the well had been used to dispose of victims' parts that were not processed in other ways. Some items had likely been submerged for as long as 3 years, preserved in the cold darkness beneath the Stillwell farm. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence of atrocities, the brothers themselves had vanished. By August of 1868, with no trace of Elias or Jeremiah, the investigation slowed. Harrington kept the case officially open, but resources shifted to other pressing concerns. The cabin remained locked, abandoned, and avoided by locals who crossed themselves as they hurried past. Parents wove warnings into bedtime stories. Never trust strangers who offer food or shelter. Over time, the land grew wild again, trees and vines reclaiming the clearing, until the Stillwell place was more legend than memory. But whispers endured. Some believed the brothers had fled westward, perhaps even overseas, escaping justice to start anew under different names. Others claimed they had met their end at the hands of a wary traveler who turned predator into prey. A third theory, darker still, imagined the brothers turning on each other, their bloody partnership collapsing in betrayal, explaining the half-eaten meal left behind in eerie silence. Whatever the truth, the Stillwells became a ghost story of the Ozark Hills, their names spoken with unease for nearly a century. The case might have remained just a chilling folktale had it not been for Clarence Thornton, a professor of history at what is now Missouri State University. Fascinated by unsolved crimes of the frontier, Thornton began digging into the story in the early 1950s. That same year, a renovation of the Webster County Courthouse unearthed a sealed compartment in the basement. Inside were records long believed destroyed in an 1892 fire. Detailed inventories of items pulled from the Stillwell property, affidavits, and even a handful of photographs taken at the scene. These grainy black and white images, among the earliest examples of crime scene photography in Missouri, breathed new life into the investigation and reignited a mystery that had been buried for nearly 100 years. The photographs recovered from the courthouse vault were faded and brittle, yet their impact was undeniable. They captured the Stillwell cabin's interior, the excavated tunnel, and the grim collection of personal belongings. One image in particular stood out. The smokehouse, meats hanging in neat rows, frozen in black and white. To those who knew what had later been discovered, the clinical detachment of the image made it even more unsettling, an ordinary scene rendered horrific by context. Among the records Thornton uncovered was a letter Sheriff Harrington had received in June of 1868 from Daviess County, Kentucky. It reported no trace of Stillwell Brothers, but detailed a case from 1861 that carried disturbing similarities. Two men, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley, had vanished after accusations of grave robbing and poisoning customers at their tavern. Their ages and descriptions matched Elias and Jeremiah precisely. Joshua, it was noted, had once apprenticed under a physician before being dismissed for misconduct. The implication was chilling. The Stillwells were almost certainly the Hartleys, who had fled Kentucky under suspicion and reinvented themselves in Missouri's chaos during the Civil War. Kentucky newspaper archives filled in more details. The Hartley brothers had operated a roadside tavern called Hartley's Rest between Owensboro and Hartford beginning in 1858. Their food was praised for its unusual flavor, drawing travelers despite the tavern's isolation. But in early 1861, reports surfaced of graves disturbed in the local cemetery. Around the same time, several travelers who had stayed at Hartley's Rest disappeared without a trace. Before authorities could act, the brothers vanished overnight, abandoning their business. The parallels to Missouri were unmistakable. Two brothers, a roadside refuge, missing travelers, and a sudden disappearance once suspicion grew too sharp. 1953, Clarence Thornton published his findings in the Journal of Ozarks Studies. His article, Serving More Than Water, The Stillwell Brothers' Reign of Terror, offered the most complete picture yet, merging original records with his new discoveries. Thornton's work reignited interest in the case and unearthed fresh testimony. An elderly woman, Sarah Wilkes, wrote to him with a family story. Her grandfather, James Wilkes, had been part of Harrington's search party in 1868. On his deathbed in 1911, he confided to his son that the party had found more than was ever recorded. A hidden room beneath the cabin floor, containing what he described as instruments of torture, and a chair fitted with restraints. According to Wilkes, Sheriff Harrington had ordered them to omit the discovery from official reports to spare the families of the missing further torment. This claim gained some credibility when Thornton examined the official inventories and noticed missing pages. The numbered lists jumped from page 7 to 11, with no explanation. Whether those pages were lost or deliberately removed remained a mystery. Thornton also drew attention to a puzzling detail at the cabin itself. The half-eaten meal on the table had been set for two, but evidence suggested a third person had been present. A chair had been pulled away from the table, and a partial footprint in spilled stew did not match either brother's boots. This fueled speculation that the Stillwells, or Hartleys, had been interrupted during that final meal by an unknown third figure, someone who might have killed them or forced them to flee. Thornton's work inspired a wave of independent research. True crime enthusiasts, historians, and even librarians across Missouri began scouring archives for other leads. In 1954, one librarian in Jefferson City uncovered an article from the St. Louis, Missouri Republican, dated January 18, 1862. It reported the arrest of two brothers named Harlow for suspicious behavior, and for possessing belongings not their own. Though they were released for lack of evidence, the timing and description bore a striking resemblance to the Hartley brothers' disappearance. suggesting that the Stillwell's trail of deception might have stretched even further than Missouri and Kentucky. The mystery, rather than fading, seemed only to grow deeper with each uncovered piece. The trail of the Stillwell, or Hartley, brothers only grew darker as researchers pieced together fragments of their shadowy past. Evidence suggested that they had worn many names across many states, shedding one identity whenever suspicion grew too sharp. A report from southern Illinois described two men calling themselves Stillmen, who operated a boarding house for 6 months in 1863. Their sudden departure followed the disappearance of a guest, and their physical descriptions matched the brothers exactly. Such discoveries painted them not as impulsive killers, but as calculating predators, refining their methods with each new alias, each narrow escape. By the time they settled in Webster County, they had perfected a system of luring travelers with hospitality and vanishing any trace of their crimes. Then, in 1955, construction workers preparing land for a new highway 12 miles north of the Stillwell property made a shocking discovery. In a shallow grave, they unearthed the skeletal remains of a man in his 30s, dead for nearly 90 years. The medical examiner found the cause of death chillingly clear: a single bullet to the back of the skull. With the remains lay a pocket watch, initials ES engraved inside the case. Investigators believed they had finally found Elias Stillwell. The location eerily aligned with trapper Theodore Palmer's testimony from 1868, that he had seen Jeremiah riding north, leading a second horse, the day before the disappearance was reported. But the details of Elias's remains hinted at something more disturbing. His right hand had been removed cleanly with a sharp instrument, not shattered or broken but deliberately taken. The act suggested ritual, or perhaps a personal vendetta, rather than mere practicality. If Jeremiah had buried his brother, was it out of guilt, rage, or a desperate bid to sever their partnership once and for all? Or had a third figure, the mysterious presence hinted at by the extra place at their final meal, ended Elias's life and driven Jeremiah into flight? Despite renewed searches, no sign of Jeremiah was ever found. Investigators combed records, from rail depots, river ports, and even coastal cities, chasing the possibility that he had fled the country under yet another name. The trail seemed cold until 1958, when a retired sheriff from Pike County, Illinois, contacted Clarence Thornton. He recalled an incident from 1869, barely a year after the Stillwells vanished. A man calling himself Jeremy Stillson, bearing a striking resemblance to Jeremiah, had been detained in Pittsfield after a suspicious death at a boarding house. Witnesses provided him an alibi, leading to his release, but he left town the very next day and was never seen again. The possibility was chilling. Jeremiah, the younger brother, might have survived, slipping into yet another false identity, continuing his predatory ways in the shadows of post-war America, but this time without Elias by his side. The legend of the Stillwell brothers was no longer just a story of a vanished cabin in Missouri. It had become a tale of men who wore masks of respectability while leaving terror and mystery in their wake, their true fate forever uncertain. The trail of Jeremiah Stillwell seemed to vanish after his possible appearance in Pittsfield, Illinois, but a century later, the echoes of his crimes continued to haunt the Ozarks. In 1967, exactly 100 years after the brothers' disappearance, the Webster County Historical Society placed a simple marker where the cabin had once stood. The plaque was discreet, noting only, "Site of the Stillwell. Cabin, 1863-1868, scene of unsolved disappearances that haunted the Ozark frontier." By then, the land had long returned to wilderness. The cabin collapsed sometime in the early 1900s, swallowed by weeds and trees. Yet locals whispered that on still nights you could hear the faint sound of digging, and that the old well sometimes gave back echoes when nothing had been dropped inside. The centennial sparked renewed media attention. The Springfield News Leader published a week-long series that drew on Thornton's findings and every scrap of recovered evidence. Families came forward with letters, journals, and rumors that added new layers of detail. Most striking was a private journal belonging to Dr. William Hayes, the county physician who had examined the remains in 1868. In entries he had deliberately withheld from official reports, Hayes described the meat found in the smokehouse in chilling detail. Certain body parts had been chosen over others, not randomly, but with preference. cuts from thighs, shoulders, and back, organs carefully removed and preserved separately. Hayes noted the work showed the precision of a butcher or someone trained in anatomy. To him, this was not just murder for profit, but a ritualized practice, a depravity that defied explanation. In 1968, another revelation shook the case. Harold Weston, great-grandson of the postal carrier Thomas Weston, donated his ancestors' papers to the Webster County Historical Society. Inside was Thomas Weston's journal, written in his later years. An entry from April of 1882 contained a confession that overturned much of what people thought they knew. Weston admitted that when he arrived at the cabin that snowy December day, he found Elias slumped dead at the table, his face in his stew, and Jeremiah holding a gun, trembling. Jeremiah, Weston wrote, said he could no longer bear the guilt and intended to confess. He forced Weston to help bury Elias north of the cabin, gave him a gold watch and $50 to stay silent, and declared he was heading for Oregon Territory. Weston's words, "May God forgive me for my silence and complicity," revealed his torment and implicated him in covering up the truth. The journal also suggested a human fracture at the heart of the brothers' horror. Elias, according to Weston, wanted to confess. Jeremiah, desperate to keep their secret, silenced him forever. Weston's further notes admitted that he had often eaten meals at the cabin, never suspecting the true nature of the stew. "How many poor souls passed my lips," he wrote. "The thought torments me nightly." He recorded that during their ride north, Jeremiah spoke of their past in Kentucky, how after their parents' deaths, desperation led to grave robbing, then murder, then the grotesque transformation of their victims into both food and profit. He described the brothers' use of herbs to drug travelers, their pride in leaving no witnesses. Weston's journal ended in 1883, the year of his death, leaving historians with the most direct yet unverifiable account of the Stillwells' final days. By the late 1960s, academic interest in the case reached new heights. The University of Missouri's anthropology department examined the old photographs and descriptions of the remains. Their analysis confirmed Hayes's suspicions. The processing was systematic, consistent, and reflected an anatomical understanding well beyond frontier necessity. Selective cuts suggested ritual preference, not just survival cannibalism. In 1969, the Missouri State Police officially closed the case, concluding that the Stillwell brothers had murdered at least 21 travelers between 1863 and 1867, robbing their valuables and processing their remains both for disposal and consumption. Yet the legend refused to rest. In the 1970s, criminologists studying serial killers cited the Stillwell case as an early example of how isolated environments and transient victims allowed predators to operate undetected. Then, in 1972, historian Eleanor Phillips unearthed a startling clue in Oregon. Territorial records showed that a man named Jerome Stillman, matching Jeremiah's description, purchased land near Portland in 1869, running a way station for 3 years, before disappearing once more. During that time, at least 2 travelers went missing after being seen heading toward his property. Though never proven, the implication was chilling. Jeremiah had indeed reached Oregon, just as Thomas Weston claimed, and had perhaps continued his predatory ways under yet another name. The Stillwell case, born in the blood and shadows of the Civil War frontier, had spanned more than a century of investigation, legend, and speculation. Whether Jeremiah died unknown in Oregon, vanished into another alias, or carried his crimes into even darker corners of America, his story endures as one of the most terrifying reminders that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from wild beasts or hostile landscapes, but from the strangers who offer you a warm meal and a place to rest. The trail of Jeremiah Stillwell, if indeed he survived as Jerome Stillman in Oregon, vanished again after 1872, when he sold his way station and disappeared from records. If he adopted yet another name, he left no trace that researchers could connect to his past identities. Whether he died in obscurity, continued his predations elsewhere, or slipped forever into anonymity, remains one of the great unanswered questions. Then, in 1975, a startling discovery reignited speculation. During renovations of a historic building in Sacramento, workers uncovered a hidden cache of papers sealed inside a wall. Among them was a journal signed only with the initials J.S., spanning the years 1873 to 1878. Its author claimed to be a cook in a Sierra Nevada mining camp, but the entries held disturbing echoes of the Stillwell case. He described special techniques for preparing meat and spoke of secret ingredients that gave his stews a reputation among the miners. The journal noted that men occasionally disappeared from camp, a detail written off at the time as common misfortune in rough frontier life. But one entry from 1877 was particularly chilling. "Sometimes I miss E in our cabin in the hills. He was weak at the end, but for years we perfected our craft together. The guests never suspected what nourishment they received at our table. Here, I must be more cautious, but the opportunities remain plentiful." Though impossible to prove, the parallels were so precise that many historians now believe Jeremiah may have resurfaced in California, carrying on his atrocities under yet another alias. The journal ended abruptly in October 1878, leaving his ultimate fate as mysterious as ever. By then, the Stillwell legend had grown into one of the darkest chapters in Ozark history. What began as the story of two quiet men offering water and rest to weary travelers had transformed into a nightmare of cannibalism, ritual, and predation that stretched across states and decades. It is a reminder that on the post-Civil War frontier, where roads were lonely and lives often depended on the kindness of strangers, danger could hide behind the warm glow of a hearth. Today, the land where the cabin once stood lies in private hands, unmarked, its history buried under new growth. The well, long whispered about in local lore, was filled in during the 1970s after animals were found dead nearby, the soil tainted by whatever seeped into it over the decades. The road that once guided travelers to the Stillwell Brothers has all but disappeared, little more than a faint depression in the forest floor. Nature has cloaked the horrors of the past, but the ground itself still carries the memory. In 1980, the Webster County Historical Society undertook an archaeological survey of the site, hoping to recover answers that had eluded investigators for more than a century. They uncovered the stone outlines of the cabin's foundation and the collapsed remains of the root cellar and smokehouse. Soil samples taken from around the well revealed unusually high concentrations of human bone fragments, silent confirmation of what had long been feared, that the well had swallowed countless victims over the years. 50 yards behind the smokehouse, archaeologists discovered a pit filled with ash and charred bone fragments, evidence that some remains had been deliberately burned to erase them. These findings confirmed the brothers' systematic approach to disposal. Some victims processed for consumption, others buried, some burned, and still others consigned to the depths of the well. And beneath the ruins of the hearth, where fire had once warmed countless travelers, they unearthed a small tin box sealed, waiting to tell one last secret from the brothers who had vanished into legend. Inside the tin box, unearthed beneath the hearth, lay a final haunting artifact. A daguerreotype photograph of two young men standing beside an older couple, almost certainly their parents. On the back, in faded script, were the words, "Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley, with mother and father, 1848. At last, the brothers' original identities were confirmed, and with it, the only known image of them. In the photograph, Ezekiel, who later assumed the name Elias, stared into the lens with a stern, unreadable expression, while Joshua, who became Jeremiah, wore the faintest of smiles. They looked utterly ordinary, reminders that true monsters rarely appear monstrous at first glance. A chilling footnote emerged from the Civil War years. In 1961, a historian combing through Union Army records found an October 1863 patrol report describing a stop at a cabin in Webster County, its location matching the Stillwell homestead. The patrol leader, Lieutenant James Emily, noted meeting two Kentucky men who offered a meal of stew and hospitality. Soon after, 3 of his men fell violently ill but recovered. Was this an early, clumsy attempt by the brothers to poison their guests? If so, it suggested their methods were still being refined, their sinister craft not yet perfected. Emily described the brothers as oddly hospitable, given the tensions of the region, and observed that their cabin seemed unusually well stocked for men so recently arrived. He even remarked that the brothers looked disappointed when the patrol continued its march rather than camp overnight. This detail fit all too neatly with their known trajectory, having begun with grave robbing in Kentucky, moving on to poisoning experiments, and ultimately developing a deadly, efficient system of predation in Missouri. Their interest in herbal medicine provided another piece of the puzzle. In 1985, a doctoral student interviewed elderly Webster County residents who had grown up with stories of the Stillwells. One woman, Martha Apprentice, then 93, recalled her grandmother's warnings. The younger brother always asked about plants that made folks sleepy or confused, she remembered. He said it was for his brother's headaches, but people later wondered if he was really using them on travelers. This fascination with plants and sedatives aligned with Joshua Hartley's brief employment as a doctor's assistant in Kentucky, where he likely gained foundational knowledge of anatomy and pharmaceuticals. Combined with Ozark folk remedies, this background could have armed the brothers with the ability to incapacitate their victims without raising suspicion. Records from Martha Simmons's general store supported this theory. Frequent purchases of valerian root, mushrooms, and large quantities of alcohol, all substances that when combined could induce drowsiness or confusion. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Stillwell case is not what was discovered, but what was lost to time. How many travelers vanished on those isolated Ozark trails, their families never learning what befell them? How many nameless victims were consumed, buried, or scattered into the soil beneath the oaks? And perhaps, most unsettling of all, could descendants of Jeremiah Stillwell or Joshua Hartley still live today under other names, unaware of, or silently guarding, their ancestors' unspeakable legacy? In 1992, the story returned to public attention when a true crime author published The Stillwell Brothers, America's Forgotten Predators. Drawing together every fragment of evidence and theory, the book became a regional bestseller and introduced the legend of the Stillwells to a new generation. For many, it was the first time they learned of the quiet brothers whose warm welcome on a cold frontier road concealed horrors beyond imagination. The case remains not only an enduring mystery of the Ozarks, but also a chilling reminder of the fragility of trust on the untamed frontier. After the 1992 book's release, a woman from Northern California reached out to the author with a family story that carried eerie echoes of the Stillwell mystery. Her great-grandfather had run a Sacramento boarding house in the late 1870s, and among his tenants was a man who called himself John Smith. Polite yet withdrawn, Smith worked as a cook in various establishments until his sudden death in 1879, reportedly from a stroke. When the boarding house owner cleaned his room, he found a locked trunk filled with watches, rings, and valuables, far beyond the means of a modest cook. Inside was also a journal, its entries so disturbing that the landlord burned it after reading only a few pages. Though unproven, the woman believed this John Smith may have been Jeremiah Stillwell, living under his final alias and carrying the weight of his crimes to an anonymous grave. If true, it meant he had escaped justice entirely. His true story buried with him while countless unknown victims remained uncounted. Even today, the memory of the Stillwell brothers lingers in the Ozark Hills. Locals say the old well, long since filled, still gives off strange echoes, and some claim that on quiet nights the sound of digging can be heard in the woods where their cabin once stood. The horror of their crimes, though softened by time, remains part of the land's memory. In 2004, their story reached national audiences when a television program on historical crimes devoted an episode to the case. Historians, criminologists, and descendants of those involved in the original investigation were interviewed. One elderly woman spoke with heartbreaking candor about her great-grandfather, who vanished in 1866. His name was later found in the Stillwell ledger. "All these years we wondered what happened to him," she said. "Now we know, though the truth is more horrible than anything we imagined." The Stillwell case, rooted in a unique moment of American history, thrived on the vulnerabilities of its time. The chaos following the Civil War, with its fractured society, weak law enforcement, and isolated homesteads, created a perfect environment for predators. Travelers were forced to rely on the hospitality of strangers, never suspecting that food and shelter could conceal their doom. The brothers' method was brutally pragmatic: lure victims with kindness, rob them, then use their remains both for consumption and as a way to erase evidence. Their hidden chamber of trophies revealed another dimension. Murder was not only profitable, but perversely gratifying. Modern criminologists recognize in the Stillwell's behavior the hallmarks of serial killing, mixed with cold pragmatism rare in contemporary cases. They chose travelers because they were least likely to be missed quickly. They refined poisons and sedatives, mastered methods of concealment, and exploited the sacred trust between host and guest. And perhaps most chilling of all, they fed their victims to other unsuspecting travelers, blurring the line between necessity, ritual, and sadistic amusement. To this day, criminology courses use the Stillwell case as a haunting study of how environment shapes crime. It shows how isolation, transient populations, and the limits of forensics can allow evil to flourish unchecked. Yet the horror of the story transcends its era. It is not only the violence, but the betrayal that resonates. Weary, souls welcomed with food, water, and rest, only to discover too late that monsters often wear ordinary faces. The Stillwell brothers remind us that the darkest evil can sit quietly at a dinner table, ladling stew into your bowl with a smile. Today, the site where the Stillwell cabin once stood has been swallowed by forest. The walls collapsed more than a century ago, the root cellar caved in, and the smokehouse returned to soil. Nature has covered the scars, yet the story endures, an unsettling legacy whispered from one generation to the next. It is remembered not only as a tale of crime, but as a lesson about the fragile line between hospitality and horror. Travelers who pass through the Missouri Ozarks along the ghost of that old road sometimes speak of an unshakable unease. A sudden chill drifts through the trees, or silence settles heavier than it should, as if the land itself has not forgotten the blood and bone buried beneath it. For those who know the history, the lesson lingers like a shadow. Not all who open their doors mean to offer kindness. Sometimes the deadliest predators are not wild beasts lurking in the woods, but the ones who greet you with a smile, ladle stew into your bowl, and promise you shelter from the storm. The Stillwell cabin has long since collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. Yet even today, whispers say the land remembers. Travelers report uneasy chills, and the old well is said to echo when nothing has been dropped inside. The story of the Stillwell brothers is more than history. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the wilderness, but from those who welcome you with a smile. If this story shook you as much as it did us, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe truly happened to Jeremiah Stillwell? And if you want more mysteries like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next untold story.